Hello and welcome back to my channel. There's quite a few new subscribers to the channel, which I think might have something to do with Scott over at Gunpowder Fiction and Plot. He recently did a video where he read 30 booktubers' favorite books, and he included me in that video. I'm not entirely sure how I ended up there amongst some of my personal favorite booktubers, but I am very grateful. So a very special welcome if you came here because of Scott's video. Yeah, let me know if you did and say hi in the comments. So what I usually do is wrap up the books I read, about 5 or 6 books at a time. I don't feel like I read enough to do like a Friday Reads type of video where I do a weekly wrap up, but then monthly wrap ups feel a little bit too daunting sometimes, depending on how much I've read in a month. So yes, doing it this way feels like a good middle. Most of the books I will be talking about today are the books I've read in February. I think only one of them is the book I read towards the end of January. That I haven't talked about yet. So I guess this is kind of a February wrap up. I'm not going to be talking about all the books I've read in February because I have read some books for the BookTube prize. So I'll talk about those in a separate video once the results of this round are announced. And then I'm also doing a video on the books I'm reading for the TBR spin. And I think I'm gonna do that quarterly. So there'll be a video of that later in March. But that still left me with 6 books to talk about, so let's just get into them. Actually, I think I'll mention 2 books I've DNF'd first. The first is The Lovely Bones by Alice Sebold. I picked this because for the Tales of Two Trails game, one of the prompts was to read a seasonal book. And this at least starts in January, so I thought it would be a good fit. I have read this book before, around when it first came out, and I remember enjoying it back then, but I just don't think it's for me anymore. It's about a teenage girl, Susie Salmon. She is raped and murdered by a man in the neighborhood, and the book is basically her being in heaven and watching her family and friends live their lives after she's gone. And there's a particular focus on the book of figuring out whether the people who are alive will figure out what has happened to her, because her body isn't found and the killer still lives in the neighborhood. I can totally see why 18-year-old me would enjoy this book, because it's a really interesting take on a murder mystery story, but I just didn't care much for it now. I think I got about a third of the way through, and there were some events happening that I didn't enjoy reading, so I basically just looked on Wikipedia and like read the plot of the book and see what would happen in the rest of the book, and I was like, yeah, I don't really want to read that. So I DNF'd it. And then the other book I didn't finish was Black Faces, White Spaces by Carolyn Finney. This was one of 2 picks for the Book Naturalist book club for February. And this is about the representation of Black people in environmentalism and outdoor recreation, just outdoor spaces, how outdoor spaces are less accessible and mean different things for white people and for Black people, and that is definitely a topic that I would be interested in reading about. This book was just way too academic for me, which is totally fair. The author talks about who she addresses the book to in the beginning, and that is mostly professionals working in the sort of broader environment nature field. And I think it would be very valuable for them, but that does make this more of a long-form scientific article rather than a more accessible non-fiction book. She outlines what she will discuss in each chapter. She talks about her research and her methodology, but then even when we get to more of the core of the book, it's still written very academically. Again, this is not a criticism, it just wasn't what I was looking for. I listened to this on audiobook, and I think if I had a print copy, I would probably just skip to the parts I wanted to learn about. But now it just wasn't really what I was hoping for. So those were two recent DNFs. Let's get into the books I've actually finished. First, I wanted to talk about two books that are a little bit similar, and my experience with them was kind of similar as well, so I'll talk about them together. And they are The Comfort of Crows by Margaret Renkl and The World of Wonders by Aimee Netzukumathatil. The Comfort of Crows was the Book Naturalist Book Club pick for January, and I listened to this on audio. It's narrated by the author herself. She has this wonderful southern accent, so that was an absolute joy to listen to. It's a collection of essays or diary entries of some sort. She basically writes an essay for every week of the year, starting in January and then going through the entire year. And in each essay she will observe something that is going on in the natural world around her, especially close to her, like close to her home, her backyard, her neighborhood and local parks, things like that. And then she connects that to things that are going on in her personal life. For example, she'll see some baby birds leaving their nest for the first time, and then she talk about her own children leaving home. And then The World of Wonders does something similar in that this is also a collection of essays where the author talks about the natural world and then links this into her personal life. But in this, the author talks about a specific plant or a specific animal in each essay. Another big part of this particular collection as well is her experience growing up as a daughter of immigrant parents, moving around a lot and often being the only brown kid in her neighborhood or in her classroom or work field. I enjoyed reading both of them. I always love nature writing and the connection of nature to someone's personal life and the lessons we can learn from observing nature. I also think the essays in both of these collections were a little bit safe. These are books that you can gift to pretty much anyone, but especially to someone you don't know well. They have a universal appeal, so it's a pretty safe bet, but I feel that also means that they lack a bit of oomph. I wanted them to be a little bit more thought-provoking. I think maybe it's because the essays are all pretty short, and if they would have been longer, maybe they would have had a little bit more depth to it. I think out of the two, World of Wonders is a bit more successful in that regard, especially towards the end. There is some really strong essays. I'll link down below one of the essays, which is a piece she wrote for Greenpeace, which is just a series of questions that her sons ask her when they are out doing a national bird count. And that one I thought was really impactful, really thought-provoking, really moving in a way that I didn't see coming. So I highly recommend reading that particular essay. It will take like 2 minutes to read, but I feel like that's an essay that will stay with you. Then I read a book in Dutch, and that is Heerlijk by Fleur Pierets. I knew the author from her memoir Julian. She wrote that after her wife had quite suddenly passed away from a brain tumor. They had plans to do a sort of performance art piece where they would get married in every country where it was where same-sex marriage was legal. I think they only got to 4 or 5 countries before they discovered that Julian had this brain tumor, and then she passed away quite shortly after that. It's a really good memoir, and it got translated into English last year, and I would highly recommend checking that one out. But I'm not talking about that book today, I'm talking about Heerlijk Monster. This is classified as fiction, but I have a feeling it's quite autobiographical. It's about a woman, an author, who has lost her wife after a short and sudden illness, and she's living this kind of nomadic lifestyle. She doesn't have a permanent address, she moves from one place to another, living out of a suitcase, and she earns her money by giving lectures and talks about queer history and culture, and about the memoir she wrote after her wife passed away. So yeah, you can see why I think the author put quite a lot of herself in this character. In this book, the narrator decides to go on a road trip through the US, inspired by the book Carol by Patricia Highsmith. In that book, the two main characters decide to take a road trip together, and the narrator of this book decides to follow the same route and visit the places that Carol and Therese have visited in the story of Carol. And in this book, the main character also ends up in a relationship with a much younger woman. So that kind of mirrors the relationship of Carol and Therese as well. And the author uses this as a framework to teach us about queer and lesbian fiction and culture, obviously focusing on the book Carol and how it was received when it first came out and the impact it had on queer culture. She muses about how things have changed since then and what has stayed the same. I find it all very, very interesting, but I'm not sure if it worked as a work of fiction for me. It is clear that the author is very knowledgeable in queer culture and history, and there's a lot that she wants to say, but it felt like she had these things she wanted to say and then she created a story around it rather than have a story where these topics were a part of. If that makes any sense. It felt a bit unnatural this way. I would absolutely love to read essays by this author. She is an activist in the queer community as well. She gives great talks and speeches, but in this format it just didn't really work for me. And also because it's quite short, she addresses all these interesting topics but then didn't give them a lot of space to develop. It just left me feeling wanting to learn more. So yeah, that was Heerlijk Monster by Fleur Pierets. The next book I read was De Nakba, de etnische zuivering van Palestina, or The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, is the original English title, by Ilan Pappé. I hope it will be obvious why I wanted to read this book. I really felt like I had a big gap in my knowledge about the history of Palestine and Israel, and I really wanted to learn more, or rather unlearn and relearn in this case, and it does exactly that. This book looks at the lead up and the events of the 1948 Palestine War and the immediate aftermath of that. And the author in this book argues that those events can be seen as an ethnic cleansing, and he goes through the events in a chronological order. And well, the book is quite dry. It just describes the events without much color, without much of a personal lens. So it's a bit of a cumbersome read in that regard. But yeah, I'm still very grateful to have read this book because it has taught me a lot. I knew a little bit about the Israeli Palestine history, but not a lot, and most of what I knew up until quite recently was from a Western or Israeli viewpoint, and this really helps viewing the current genocide going on in Palestine, and how the events of the past, or what happened in this book, are still influential and still continuing today. I think this book really demonstrates how using different words and creating a different rhetoric around events will change the way you view them. And that's why I think the author made a good choice in this book to very much stick to the facts and stick to the events, and then let the reader decide for themselves what they think about that. And that made me feel incredibly frustrated and angry, because it seems like the facts speak for themselves. But yet Israel has gotten away with crimes back in 1948, just as they are getting away with it now, and it really feels like nothing has changed. It made me think about what other narratives have been changed just so they can serve the Western world. Like I said, there is a lot of unlearning and relearning going on in my head right now, and I think doing this is the bare minimum that one should be doing in regards to Palestine. The next book is something quite different, and it's a middle grade novel. Look, if Karen of the Roman Reader makes a video saying she has read her favorite book of the year in February, mind you, you have to read it, right? So this is The Probability of Everything by Sarah Everett. I listened to this on audio. It was narrated by Jordan Cobb. Like I said, this is a middle grade novel, and I'm putting this in the pre-apocalyptic genre. I'm not even sure if that exists, but that's what I'm calling it. It's about this young girl, I think she's 11 years old, called Kemi. And she loves science, and especially math, and especially probability. And right at the beginning of the book, we learn that there's an asteroid in the sky which has a 84.7% chance of colliding with the Earth in a couple of days' time, destroying the planet, or at least a big chunk of it. We don't really get the specifics of this. So faced with this, Kemi is obviously worried about what will happen to her family and her friends, and she's afraid that when she and her family will die because of the asteroid, there will be no one to remember her and remember the wonderful things that make up her family. So she decides to make a time capsule, and she asks all the people around her to give her something to put in this time capsule. Something that is meaningful to them, or something that makes them happy, something that they will feel tells the story of their family. Her dad is the one who struggles the most with what he wants to put in, and Kemi tries to help him with that. And they're like doing all the things he loves together. I think for a middle grade book, this deals with a lot of big topics like racism, like mental health, like grief, but it makes it palatable. I think it teaches valuable lessons about overcoming difficult and unimaginable situations, about celebrating the people and the things that makes us happy. Yeah, I think it's a wonderful story. The plot is really well done, with the tension building. There's some really remarkable characters in this book as well, who all got their place to shine. It's really sad in some places. I definitely teared up a couple of times, but then in the end it does feel quite hopeful and like a celebration of life. And then the last book I want to talk about today is Maurice by E.M. Forster. This is the Dutch translation. They recently did a reissue of this book. Just in case you were wondering what the edition was, I really like this cover anyway. This book I think is very well known for being published posthumously. Forster wrote this in 1914, but it didn't get published until 1977, 7 years after he passed away. At the time of writing, homosexuality was illegal, So publishing it then would have had some really serious consequences, because this book is about gay relationships, and more importantly it's about gay relationships without negative consequences, meaning no one will die or get ill because of being gay, which was the only acceptable way to talk about a gay relationship at that time. You could be gay, but you had to be punished for it. This book centers around a young man named Maurice. He is starting his first year at Cambridge University when he meets Clive, a fellow student. And with him, Maurice starts to discover his sexuality, and they have a intimate but very secret and forbidden relationship. That is the basic setup of the story, and I think that's enough to know going in. I don't want to give too much away. I really enjoyed this book. I think it's a really great depiction of life as a gay person at that time in that particular college setting. I imagine that there were quite a few young gay men having similar relationships as Maurice and Clive had in this book, dealing with the same internal struggles as Maurice is dealing with. I especially loved that there was space for queer joy in this book as well. Maurice is something who struggles greatly with being gay. He has a lot of internalized homophobia just because of the time he grows up in and how homosexuality is viewed at that time. But the author also shows the way Maurice is his most authentic self when he is able to express his love and his affection and physical attraction to men. And I love that we spend time with him going on secret dates and spending time with the men he loves, and just them having a joyful time together. Having said that, Maurice isn't a likable character. He is quite bland, a little bit snobbish. In a lot of ways he's just quite boring and unremarkable, but you still wish him happiness and you wish him a chance to be with the person he loves, even though I couldn't stand his sense of entitlement at some points. The author also touches upon differences in religious beliefs and the clash between different classes as well, which I thought gave an interesting extra layer to the story. The writing style, especially in the beginning, I had to get used to it a bit. It felt a bit stiff and a bit formal. Maybe that's because of the time it was written, but also maybe because the author at the beginning felt a bit uncomfortable to write this story. As the book progressed, the writing felt a bit more accessible, and like the author felt a little bit more at ease writing this book as he went on. Yeah, I think this book has dated in a lot of ways, and you have to view it within the time it was written. But keeping that in mind, it must have been really groundbreaking at the time, and I really appreciate its place in queer literature. So yeah, I really enjoyed it. I don't think it will become a favorite, but I am really glad that I read it. So yeah, those were the 6 books I wanted to talk about today. If you have any thoughts on any of the books I've read today, please leave a comment down below. I'd love to have a chat, and I will see you in the next video. Bye bye.